Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the golden glow of Versailles, past the murmuring fountains and candlelit windows, to shadow one of history's most finicky eaters, Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. His palace was a monument to overindulgence, but as you'll see, his diet was not merely excessive. It was bizarrely regimented, surprisingly political, and just complicated enough to confuse even a Michelin chef. Picture it, a table groaning with pheasants, artichokes, eel pie, and candied violets, all while the king picks at bread, then suddenly devours half a roast boar. Your stomach already hurts, and we haven't even gotten to the oysters. And yet, spoiler, you probably wouldn't survive a single dinner at his table. Between the mealtime etiquette, digestive powders, and relentless public chewing, it's less of a relaxing feast and more of an edible opera. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from a chateau or just a creaky old apartment, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where we all gather to fall asleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit at a long table. It's early morning, and already there are too many spoons. The first thing you need to know about breakfast at Versailles is that it wasn't breakfast. Not as you know it. Louis XIV didn't believe in such modern nonsense. He usually rose around 8 or 9 a.m., but the first meal of the day didn't arrive until hours later, after layers of ceremony, dressing, prayer, meetings, and perhaps a casual decree or two. If your stomach growls during the king's levee, you'd best chew on your sleeve. The Sun King wasn't entirely heartless. He would occasionally take a cup of broth, or perhaps a small biscuit dipped in wine, to tide him over during the morning rituals. But a true petit déjeuner? That was reserved for lesser mortals, like the courtiers who might sneak a nibble of bread in secret, preferably where no one of rank could see them. Now you're wondering, why all the fasting? Well, part of it was fashion. Eating too early in the day was seen as rustic, even peasant-like. The nobility prided themselves on appetite restraint, a strange irony considering the feasts to come. But more importantly, Louis liked his meals to be events. To be seen eating was to be seen living, and no one wanted to witness their divine monarch chewing toast alone in the gray light of dawn. Meals were spectacles, carefully staged. He was a performer, and the stage wasn't set until midday. Wait. Hours pass. You trail behind the golden slippers of valets, dodge a scowling duchess, and bow approximately 57 times before the smell of roast fowl finally wafts through the corridors. By now, the palace is practically vibrating with hunger. The midday meal, what Louis considered his main eating occasion, was called Le Grand Couvert. It took place in public. Yes, public. Imagine trying to enjoy a roast pigeon while 80 people silently watch you dab your lips. But Louis adored it. He relished being observed. The very act of eating confirmed his vitality, his supremacy, his divine right to rule. Every bite was a miniature affirmation. I eat, therefore I reign. The table setting alone took over an hour. There were strict protocols for cutlery placement, bread arrangement, and even how the napkins were folded. Spoiler, the napkin art was usually swan-shaped. Because of course it was. Now here comes the food. The first course might include a dozen different soups. Creamy, brothy, herbal, sometimes with suspicious chunks floating in them. Then come the boiled meats, lamb, veal, ox tongue. After that, a parade of roasted game, ducks, pheasants, wild boar, all swimming in sauces so rich they could buy property. Vegetables were rare and often overcooked. Louis, like many nobles of the time, believed that vegetables were poor people food and probably dangerous to one's health. They were too moist, he thought, too green. They might imbalance your humors. Yes, the humors. In case you're new here, welcome to the medieval medical hangover. Health, in Louis's day, was dictated by balancing four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much spinach? That's clearly a phlegm problem. Better eat more salted meat. That be why the time you've reached the pastry course, you are full. So full. And yet the king is just getting started. He's popped a tiny candy into his mouth, some sugared rose petal thing, and is now sipping wine infused with orange peel and cinnamon. People are applauding. You glance to your left and realize you're seated beside someone who hasn't blinked in 10 minutes. That's because blinking would mean missing a royal mouthful. This is normal. Sometimes, Louis would invite ambassadors to watch him eat, as a form of soft diplomacy. Imagine trying to negotiate a treaty while your host noisily devours a goose leg. Of course, there were mishaps. One chronicler noted that Louis once choked briefly on a cherry pit, prompting gasps from the entire court and an emergency consultation with his personal physician. The pit was expelled with great drama. A lesson, perhaps, in the dangers of fruit, and just when you think it's over, it's not. After the meal, Louis would retreat for a digestive walk in the gardens, followed by a perfumed nap. You, meanwhile, are left to wobble through the marble halls, clutching your stomach, wondering if that eel mousse was supposed to be cold. Back in the early part of his reign, Louis was younger, more sprightly, and a bit more adventurous with food. He sampled dishes brought in from the far corners of the French Empire: pineapple from the Caribbean, cocoa from New Spain, coffee from the Ottoman world. Not all of these experiments went well. One unlucky afternoon, after downing a mug of overly sweetened hot chocolate, Louis declared it interesting, and then promptly vomited into a gilded vase. The vase is still in the Louvre, though mercifully cleaned. He once tried curry, brought by a Jesuit missionary, and reportedly said it tasted like peppered hay. The missionary was quietly reassigned to rural Alsace. Despite these culinary explorations, Louis always returned to his staples: roast meats, hearty stews, and endless confections. He had a notorious sweet tooth, one that would eventually rot most of his teeth. Courtiers reported that his breath could empty a salon. One particularly brave noble once offered the king a mint, cleverly disguised as a token of admiration. It did not go over well. Still, Louis never let dental misfortune stop him. He simply ordered his food softer. Royal chefs developed elaborate pureed versions of meats and fruits, sometimes molded into their original shapes so they looked more solid. Imagine mashed duck reshaped to look like a duck. It's strange, it's soft, and it's very Versailles. Now picture the servants. Hundreds of them. From kitchen boys to meat carvers to the footmen who carried dishes through labyrinthine corridors. Each meal was a logistical ballet, and if one dish was late, or worse, cold, heads didn't roll, but reputations surely did. That you're starting to understand why Louis skipped breakfast. It wasn't laziness. It was scheduling. Eating in the 17th century, when you were a king, was a full-time job. It starts with the growl of a stomach. Not yours. You've been chewing imaginary bread all morning. But the collective grumble of 3,000 courtiers who have been fasting in silence, waiting for one man to take a single bite at Versailles. Hunger had a hierarchy. You could be a duke, a bishop, even a visiting prince. But if Louis hadn't eaten yet, neither had you. To eat before the king was a breach of etiquette so severe it could cost you favor, prestige, even a royal glare, which, to be fair, was known to curdle fresh cream. Meals were not private events. They were theater, elaborate, choreographed, and scheduled to the rhythms of one man's bowels. If Louis was delayed by a consultation, a bout of gout, or simply a well-timed nap, then the entire palace waited. With empty plates, there were exceptions, of course. High-ranking nobles with private apartments and discreet kitchens sometimes snuck a morsel. But even then, servants were trained to look nervous while passing food trays. It was etiquette by stealth. Meanwhile, the lower echelons of the court, valets, musicians, chambermaids, developed an internal clock for the king's hunger patterns. Rumors flew like doves. He took an early broth, or he refused the mint tea, each whisper shifting the palace's gastric schedule by an hour. This synchronized fasting had architectural consequences. Did you know Versailles has no kitchens directly beneath the main dining areas? That's because food odor was considered undignified. Instead, food was prepared in distant outbuildings and carried over in insulated boxes. By the time it arrived, it was often lukewarm. But if Louis ate it, so did everyone else. Lukewarm became the height of refinement. Hunger sharpened everything. Tempers flared. Powdered wigs sagged. Once, during a particularly delayed dinner, a marquis fainted into a soup tureen. He was revived with brandy and shame. This delicate etiquette also extended to seating. No one could sit until the king sat. And once he began, the dining room transformed from a marble hall of murmurs to a concentrated ballet of movement. Platters pivoted, goblets rotated, mouths opened only after glancing left and right for visual cues. Children, if they were present, were trained not to chew too loudly. One duchess reportedly trained her 7-year-old to swallow soft cheese whole, lest he squeak during a royal swallow. And yet, some people loved this system. It brought order, predictability. You knew your place, literally, and what to expect. Louis's dining routine was a cornerstone of his power. In a kingdom riddled with political intrigue, taxation troubles, and ongoing wars, the king's digestive health was oddly reassuring. If the king ate well, surely France was stable. Historians still argue whether this enforced hunger was a conscious power move or simply the byproduct of royal routine. Was it strategic? Or just indigestion masquerading as majesty? Either way, you're still hungry. So is everyone else. Eventually, a bell rings. Not for prayer, not for war, but for lunch. A golden procession begins. Silver trays glide down corridors. A fish tranche glistens like armor. Somewhere, a flutist breaks into spontaneous relief. You line up with everyone else. Hunger has equalized you. For a moment, everyone is the same. Nobles, guards, scribes, all dreaming of gravy. And at the very front of it all, one man, one chair, one plate. The king that he raises a spoon. You hold your breath that he takes a bite. The court exhales. Lunch begins. Imagine being so important that your lunch requires an audience. Not friends, not family, an actual audience. Rows of courtiers, diplomats, scribes, and occasionally confused tourists. Well, they're 17th century equivalents. All gathered not to dine with you, but to observe you chewing with divine purpose. Welcome to the Grand Couvert. The Grand Couvert, literally, the Great Covered Meal, was one of Louis XIV's most symbolic rituals. It wasn't every day, but often enough that palace veterans could predict it by the tempo of the morning drums or the shine on the butler's cuffs. When it happened, you knew. Today, we eat by royal performance. Here's how it worked. A long table, sometimes absurdly long, was arranged in one of Versailles public halls. Louis would sit at the head, upon a gilded armchair known simply as the fauteuil d'or, the golden chair. Other royals might be allowed to sit if they were of suitable rank and family. Everyone else, standing room only. For hours, as you enter the room, you hear the rustle of silk and brocade. No one speaks above a whisper. The chamber is lined with courtiers dressed as if they were going to a coronation, all to watch a man eat soup. But this wasn't mere gluttony, it was governance. In Louis's worldview, the king's body was France. Its movements, needs, and indulgences were public affairs. Eating, then, was not a private act. It was a national event. The grand couvert made visible his strength, his taste, his health. It made France feel full. The performance began with ritual. Dishes were carried in by an entourage of servants, each one chosen not for cooking skills, but for family connections and court favor. The chief steward led the procession like a priest, bearing the royal napkin as if it were sacred scripture. The silver was polished like mirrors. The plates were hand-painted with scenes from Greek mythology. Even the spoons had lineage. And then, silence. The king took his seat. That simple action caused a cascade. Chairs creaked, fans lowered, breaths were held. At a gesture, the first course appeared. A velouté of partridge, perhaps, or a consommé, so clear it reflected the ceiling. Louis didn't rush. Each motion, knife, fork, sip, was deliberate. He often spoke between bites, commenting on theater, politics, or someone's terribly embroidered sleeves. Laughter was allowed, but must not exceed a murmur. Applause, on very rare occasions, erupted. Once after he devoured an entire leg of lamb without breaking eye contact with the Spanish ambassador. You think that's exaggerated? Eyewitnesses recorded that particular leg of lamb incident in their diaries. It was discussed for weeks. Historians still argue whether it was meant as intimidation or indigestion. Now, some of the audience didn't come for statecraft. Some came for fashion. To see who sat next to whom, who wore what gemstone, who fainted from the heat. Think of it as an extremely elite version of a high school cafeteria crossed with an opera box. Even the mistakes were part of the spectacle. Once, a footman tripped on a loose rug and dropped a pheasant onto a bishop's shoes. The bird was retrieved, wiped discreetly, and placed back onto the king's platter without a word. Louis took a bite and said, crunchier than usual, then continued. Behind the table, lesser servants signaled to kitchen runners, 2 steps removed from the culinary chaos, who were themselves translating gestures into messages for the distant chefs. Louis wanted less salt. That message might take 10 minutes to reach the seasoning station. By the time the correction came back, the course had changed. But the point wasn't perfection. It was continuity. Flow. Majesty. As the meal progressed, desserts entered like an encore. Fruit sculptures, sugar castles, custards trembling with anxiety. The king might take 1 spoonful, or none. No one dared guess. Eventually, he would rise. Not with ceremony, but with calm authority. That rising was your cue. The orchestra stopped. Guests bowed. The courtiers sighed, and the gossip began. What had he eaten? What hadn't he touched? Was he well? Did he frown during the spinach? In the grand couvert, every crumb was a message. And you, like the rest of France, were expected to interpret it. Before the silver cloches were lifted, before the trumpets announced the opening of the dining doors, before even the napkins were swanned into ceremonial folds, there was the list. The list, if you've never seen an 18th century royal menu, imagine a scroll that could double as a sail. The sheer volume of dishes served at Louis XIV's meals was so excessive, it bordered on logistical satire. We're not talking 5 courses. Try 15, and within those, sometimes 10 sub-dishes each that a standard grand couvert menu might begin innocently. 2 soups, 3 salads, a couple of light roasts. Then came the middle warmings, dishes that existed to lull your stomach into false security. Pigeon pies, asparagus with truffle sauce, maybe a soft calf's brain in butter. Next, the real action. 8 kinds of poultry, 6 of red meat, dozens of fish depending on the day and liturgical calendar. Shellfish had its own category. By the time you reached the cheese table, there were over 20 varieties waiting. And then desserts. Desserts. A flamboyant display of sugar engineering, where taste was optional, but visual flair was not. Sculpted marzipan gardens, spinning sugar windmills, and something called a paste of gold leaf and jam. That sounds as luxurious as it was probably inedible. Each menu was planned by the king's household department, the Maison du Roi, weeks in advance. Ingredients were ordered in bulk, and we mean bulk. For just one dinner, 300 eggs, 100 quails, 200 oysters, 40 pounds of sugar. Wine was served by the barrel, not bottle. It's estimated Versailles consumed over 10,000 bottles per month just for routine meals. Imagine the recycling. Serving it all was a choreographed feat. Dishes had to arrive hot, garnished, and positioned exactly per a drawn map of the table. Yes, they used diagrams. You don't just plop a roast duck beside a lemon tart and hope for the best. Every dish had placement based on temperature, smell, symbolism, and the king's shifting whims. Portion sizes varied. Louis might take one bite of something or none, but every dish had to be available in full. And should he request a second helping, another identical platter would need to appear instantly, like a culinary ghost. Now, the king didn't eat all of this. Of course not. He couldn't. But the food served was as much for show as for consumption. The court watched to see what he touched, what he ignored. Even the leftovers were political. High-ranking courtiers sometimes fought for the right to eat the remains of a dish the king had glanced at. They called them les restes. Getting a leg of pheasant with a royal bite missing was practically a blessing. And remember, this happened regularly, not just for coronations or national holidays. At Versailles, indulgence was the default setting. Some guests reported being so overwhelmed by choice they forgot to eat it all. One Spanish diplomat noted that he sat for 3 hours, nodding politely at soup. The table itself had a life of its own. Long enough to require echo management, it was covered with fine linens, then a second layer to hide any seams. Centerpieces changed weekly, sometimes daily. Flowers, fruit towers, mirrored pyramids, all rotated like stage props to maintain freshness. Some dishes were swapped during the meal. That roast you saw at the start? Replaced halfway through with a hotter twin. It was like a magic trick done in meat, and the cost? Astronomical. Feeding the court at this level consumed a major chunk of France's operating budget. Versailles was not just a palace. It was a financial sinkhole glazed with aspic. Historians still debate whether Louis's dietary grandeur strengthened or weakened his rule. But the records are clear. He never skipped a course to SO. Next time you're overwhelmed by a brunch menu with 4 options, remember, Louis XIV needed a map just to find the cheese. You wake to the sound of horns that it's not war. It's not theater. It's something far more ritualistic and, somehow, more essential, the royal hunt. And you, lucky sleeper, have been summoned, though not to hunt. No, your job is to observe how hunting shaped the appetite of a king. For Louis XIV, hunting was more than recreation. It was statecraft with antlers, a way to display strength, endurance, and masculine virtue. He did not just sit on horseback for effect, he rode hard. He chased deer, boars, hares, and occasionally even wolves through the forests of Saint-Germain and Fontainebleau. The hunts were scheduled, often daily, and meticulously planned with the same detail as a military campaign. The result? An appetite worthy of an empire. There's a kind of primal poetry in it. Kill the beast, roast the beast, eat the beast. And though Louis rarely killed the animals himself, too risky for a divine right monarch, he took great pleasure in the hunt's exertion. The sweat, the chase, the roar of the horns. And afterward, flushed with triumph and bramble scratches, he would return to Versailles demanding meat. Hearty, bloody, hot meat. His cooks knew this pattern well. On hunting days, they doubled the meat supply and have the desserts. The kitchen swarmed with spit-turners, sauce-stirrers, and frantic apprentices hacking at haunches of venison and wild boar. Roasted game became a centerpiece. Not just for meals, but for visual display. A favorite showpiece was a whole stag glazed in wine and spices, brought out with antlers intact, and surrounded by smaller birds posed in flight. The birds were not edible. They were there to flatter the stag. Louis would take a ceremonial first slice. Sometimes it was only for effect. Sometimes he carved and served pieces to favored guests, a gesture of rare intimacy. Receiving a piece of boar from the king's own fork? You'd probably write home about it in all caps. But beyond spectacle, the hunt informed his mood. If it went well, he ate with boisterous joy, recounting the chase in vivid detail. If it went poorly, if a horse stumbled or the quarry escaped, he might eat little, sulking over a dry pigeon leg. The link between appetite and ego was unmistakable. Louis's body was not just royal, it was responsive. To terrain, to triumph, to frustration. His meals were a mirror to his pride. The courtiers learned to read this. They would comment gently on the tenderness of the venison or the smoky aroma of the pheasant, hoping to lift his spirits or keep them high. But not all were thrilled with the hunt's influence. The palace's physician, Fagan, frequently warned Louis that too much red meat and excitement could inflame his gout. Louis listened, and then ordered more duck. Still, compromise was possible. On certain days, fish or poultry followed the hunt, under the illusion of health. Dishes like rabbit in white wine, quail in herb broth, or larks baked in milk, each pretending to be lighter fare while still deeply indulgent. Historians still debate whether the royal hunt truly enhanced Louis's power or simply fed his vanity. Some argue it unified the court, giving nobles a reason to chase both deer and favor. Others believe it distracted from pressing matters, taxation, war, plague, by substituting roast boar for reform. But in that moment, back at Versailles, as the scent of charred marrow and rosemary wafts through the corridors, none of that matters. Not to Louis, not to his cooks, not to you, because you're already dreaming of lunch. Let's play a game. I'll describe a dish, and you try to guess what it is. Ready? Here we go. It's thick, greenish, simmered for 10 hours. Contains at least one live ingredient, and was once served with a side of grated nutmeg and Madeira wine, that if you guess turtle soup, you win. And you now understand the curious depths of Louis XIV's palate. This wasn't just any turtle soup. This was potage de tortue royale, made with freshwater turtles from the Loire, slow-cooked in veal stock, and spiked with a concoction so pungent the kitchen staff wore nosecloths. The result? A silky, slightly gelatinous brew that Louis declared unexpected but noble. We're diving into the world of the king's favorite dishes. Not the obvious roasts or fancy pastries, but the strange, obscure, and long-forgotten things that delighted one of the most powerful men in history. Take, for example, candied artichoke hearts. A dish that sounds like a punishment until you taste it, or so the chefs claimed. Artichokes were boiled, pureed, mixed with sugar syrup, orange zest, and a whisper of rosewater, then cooled into a dense jelly. Served in silver spoons, it was more perfume than pudding. Louis reportedly liked it because it reminds the tongue that even bitterness can be civilized. Another oddity? Pigeon stuffed with pistachios and anchovy paste. A flavor combination that sounds like a dare, yet appeared often enough in the records to suggest fondness. Paired with stewed endive and dusted with breadcrumbs, it was one of the few dishes that spanned both his lunch and supper menus. Then there were the tiny dishes, the amuse-bouches before the term existed. Quail eggs preserved in lavender vinegar, pickled melon rind, a paste made of crushed chestnuts and smoked eel. Some guests found these eccentric. Others found them divine. Louis found them amusing that he adored surprise. Meals were not just nourishment, they were puzzles, games, emotional explorations. One chef invented a dish called Silence of the Swan, which turned out to be a chilled consommé shaped like a bird, with a hollow inside that, when tapped, released a puff of anise-scented steam. No one remembers what it tasted like. They just remember the gasp when it opened. His fondness for jellied meats bordered on obsession. Calf's foot, duck, rabbit, even peacock, all jellied. These were known as salmis en glacé, and they looked like gemstone tranches. Their wobbly texture was considered fashionable, their taste secondary. The king once sent an entire jellied boar to the Duchess of Burgundy as a wedding gift. She replied with a polite thank you and 2 jellied turtles. And then, perhaps strangest of all, wine soup. A blend of dry white wine, crushed almonds, cinnamon, and day-old bread. Served hot in the winter and cold in summer, it was meant to invigorate the blood and warm the melancholy humors. Modern tasters have compared it to boozy oatmeal. Was it all delicious? Probably not. But that wasn't the point. These dishes weren't chosen to be liked. They were chosen to be remembered. And Louis, lover of spectacle, eater of history, would choose drama over digestibility any day. Historians still argue whether the king's taste was genuinely adventurous or simply performative. Was he a true gourmand? Or a man playing gourmand to keep his court guessing? Perhaps it doesn't matter. Because if you're seated at that long table, staring at a bowl of translucent aspic that smells faintly of violets and goat, you're not thinking about authenticity, that you're wondering whether to eat it before it eats you. There is a paradox at the heart of Louis XIV's table. The sheer abundance of food, the architectural feasts, the lavish menus designed by teams of culinary strategists, all would lead you to believe the king ate like a lion. And yet, he often didn't. More than one courtier, scribbling in a corner with ink-stained fingers and an empty stomach, noted the Sun King's curious restraint. While the dishes piled high, Louis himself might consume only a few select bites, 3 spoons of broth, a bit of white meat, and perhaps a sugared almond. Enough to stage a spectacle, but never enough to suggest gluttony. Why? Why all the food, if the king barely touched it? Well, let's unpack that. First, there was performance. Louis believed in eating as theater, not necessarily for the satisfaction of hunger. The food on his table was there to be seen as much as tasted, a symbol of power, wealth, and the state's ability to command nature itself into edible obedience. Second, digestion. Louis suffered from chronic health issues, recurring gout, dental pain, and general digestive complaints that would make most modern dinner guests politely decline an invitation. His physicians, especially the infamous Dr. Fagan, kept him on an elaborate regimen of broths, soft meats, and restorative tonics made of herbs, wine, and the occasional powdered gemstone. He was encouraged to eat modestly. Too much spice? Risk of phlegm. Too much meat? Gout. Too much fruit? Colic. And heaven forbid he paired dairy with fish. One doctor swore it could trigger melancholy. Oh, he nibbled. He gestured. He praised. But mostly, he let others eat, which brings us to a hidden truth. The real beneficiaries of Louis's meals were not always Louis. Once the king took his leave, or declared himself done, the real frenzy began. Courtiers, especially those in favor, were granted access to the leftovers. Known as les restes, these dishes carried a strange prestige. Eating what the king had rejected was seen as an honor. Servants might claim the platter. Nobles might negotiate for scraps. The food didn't go to waste. It went into rotation. Leftovers were repurposed, reseasoned, or quietly shuttled to other tables. Some even ended up in the apartments of favored mistresses who treated half-eaten desserts like handwritten love notes. There was also a more furry audience. Louis had dozens of dogs, and not the scrappy kind. These were royal companions, with names, titles, and, yes, personalized silver bowls. Anything deemed too tough, too salty, or too oddly shaped might end up in a bowl marked Philu or Mimi. One spaniel reportedly lived to 19 on a diet of roast squab and almond paste. The chefs knew this. They planned for it. The food wasn't just designed for the king's mouth. It was designed for courtly circulation. Sometimes, the king himself contributed to this redistribution. If he found a dish amusing but unappetizing, he might hand it to a nearby noble with a wink and say, "Perhaps your palate is braver than mine." Translation: I dare you. Historians still argue whether this selective eating reflected a refined palate, chronic health management, or plain theatrical vanity. But one thing's certain: Louis knew how to hold a fork like a scepter and wield a spoon like policy. And as you sit there, watching him push a piece of trout around his plate like it's a diplomatic mission, you realize he may not be eating much, but he's feeding everyone. Let's take a break from the silver platters and roasted fowl. Tonight, we wander into a quieter, more curious corner of Versailles. The royal medicine cabinets, the apothecary tables, the velvet pouches of scented mystery that helped Louis XIV digest all those banquets. Welcome to the world of powdered pearls, sugared violets, and wines so herbaceous it could probably clear sinuses and bloodlines. Louis's court was obsessed with health, not necessarily in the way you or I might define it, but in terms of balance, harmony, and appearance. The king was the living embodiment of France. If he burped in public, it wasn't indigestion. It was potentially a national omen. To keep everything flowing, so to speak. Louis relied on an ever-rotating cocktail of herbal additives, elixirs, and medicated cordials. Some were prescribed. Others were just fashionable that a typical day might begin with a draught of warm water infused with fennel and thyme, meant to wake the stomach without shocking it. Mid-morning, he might take a tincture of gentian root, saffron, and orange peel. These stomach bitters were prized not for taste, but for their supposed power to coax sluggish bile into action. Then came the powders. Oh, the powders! There was powdered antelope horn, rare, ground to dust, imported at great cost. Powdered lapis lazuli, mostly useless, but gorgeously blue. And powdered pearl, a favorite, cooling to the blood, said to enhance complexion. Most of these were mixed with honey or wine before consumption. Some were snorted. Some were rubbed on the temples, that a personal favorite of the king. Angelica root, mixed into sugar pastilles and kept in a monogrammed box at his bedside. These little discs were supposed to ward off plague, gout, and melancholy. They also smelled faintly like licorice and lavender. And we haven't even gotten to the perfumed wines. These were not for sipping. These were for digesting. Wines infused with rosemary, sage, mint, hyssop, cinnamon bark, and sometimes musk. Served warm, in tiny glass phials. Some were so potent, they were handled with gloves. One apothecary noted that a single drop of wine of laudanum and sweet balm caused the marquis to see angels, or possibly just the chandelier. After particularly heavy meals, the king might receive a cleansing cordial consisting of powdered rhubarb root, warm milk, and clove oil. It worked. We'll leave it at that. Even meals themselves were dosed with herbs. Parsley for the kidneys, anise for the wind, sage to keep the tongue sharp. Cooks consulted physicians almost as often as spice merchants. A roast duck might be laced with chamomile if the king had slept poorly. A sorbet might be garnished with powdered charcoal for obvious reasons. One of the most infamous concoctions was simply called the Emperor's Dust. It was said to contain over 30 ingredients, among them gold flakes, saffron, dried rose petals, powdered oyster shell, and something called oriental gum. No one knew exactly what it did, but everyone agreed it was terribly expensive. The court took its cues. Nobles mimicked the king's tonics. If Louis favored wormwood that week, so did the duchesses. If he frowned after sniffing cardamom, cardamom sales dropped in Paris. Historians still argue over which of these potions were actually effective, and which were glorified incense for the stomach. Some modern analysts have suggested the sheer quantity of herbs may have done more harm than good. Others think they merely masked deeper problems. But here's the funny part. Louis lived to be 76, in an era where most people were lucky to hit 50. So maybe, just maybe, those powdered violets did something after all. Or maybe it was the soup. Beneath the gold filigree, the silk curtains, and the dizzying scent of roast meats and marzipan, there was heat, and sweat, and shouting. Welcome to the kitchens of Versailles. If you imagine an orderly line of white-hatted chefs gracefully plating tiny soufflés, you may want to adjust your expectations. This was a military-grade operation, chaotic, relentless, and staffed by over 300 people at any given moment. They didn't just cook for a king. They fed an empire of mouths that orbited his table like moons. At the heart of it all were the unsung heroes of gastronomy, the cooks. Most of them are anonymous. Their names don't appear in the royal diaries or the flattering memoirs of the court. But they were there, dozens of them, from master sauciers to pottagers, from pastry specialists to scullery boys who scrubbed copper pots until they could see their sunken cheeks in the reflection. They worked in the Œil de Bœuf wing, in kitchens so vast you could get lost between the poultry room and the fish scaling station. The noise was constant: knives, boiling pots, the occasional squawk of a live goose, and orders shouted in a dozen dialects of French. The air was thick with duck fat and urgency. Cooks lived in service. They often slept near their stations, took their meals in shifts, and kept changes of shirt hidden under chopping blocks in case of surprise inspections. A cook with dirty cuffs could be dismissed. A cook who burned a sauce for the Dauphin might be reassigned to soup duty for a month. Everything was managed under the watchful eyes of the maitres d'hôtel and the premier cuisinier du roi, the king's head chef. These men were part artisan, part bureaucrat. They designed menus, negotiated with suppliers, tracked inventory, and navigated palace politics with more grace than some ministers. Food was delivered at odd hours. Fish came in the night from Normandy. Pigs arrived squealing at dawn. Herbs were clipped at sunrise from the royal gardens or rushed in from Paris markets in velvet-lined boxes to prevent bruising. Freshness was sacred. Nothing stale entered the royal stomach. Training was brutal. Apprentices learned to deb one partridge in the dark, fillet eel without flinching, and plate 40 artichokes in under 10 minutes. One former kitchen boy recalled practicing whipped egg whites until he could create a peak that resembled the Queen's hairstyle. And yet, despite the pressure, the kitchens were oddly communal. Recipes were shared, secrets whispered, nicknames bestowed. One particularly skilled pâtissier was called Saint Sugar because his confections were said to make even gouty nobles weep with joy. Occasionally, a dish rose to fame. The creator of the famed duck à la Louis was allowed to present it in person, a once-in-a-career honor. The king praised it with a nod. The chef fainted from joy. Failures, of course, were less romantic. Oversalted broth? The tray would be sent back without comment. Undercooked game? The steward might arch an eyebrow. But worst of all, indifference. If Louis said nothing, if he didn't even notice, your career might be as over as yesterday's pheasant. Historians still marvel at how such a vast operation functioned daily. Records suggest they served between 500 to 1,200 dishes per day, depending on ceremonies, weather, and royal appetite. And through it all, through the fire and the noise, the cooks labored with the quiet pride of those who know they are invisible, yet essential. Oh, next time you picture Louis sipping turtle soup, spare a thought for the man who spent 6 hours coaxing flavor from a reluctant reptile. To understand Louis XIV's table, you must first understand the kitchens, and not just a room or two, but an entire sub-city of fire, smoke, shouting, and movement that pulsed beneath the polished elegance of Versailles. The palace kitchens were not adjacent to the dining halls. That would have been too sensible and far too aromatic. Smells, after all, were considered vulgar. The king preferred his halls to smell of wax, roses, and powdered courtiers, not onions and duck f-etis. Oh, the food had to travel. Prepared in vast outbuildings located hundreds of yards from the dining chambers. Each dish journeyed through a relay of servants, passageways, and wind-battered courtyards. The food was covered, wrapped, insulated, and timed with precision. It was a kind of culinary relay race, where a roast could win or lose based on the gait of a footman or the stiffness of the wind. Inside the kitchens, the atmosphere was nothing short of controlled chaos. There were over a dozen designated areas, each devoted to a specialty. The garde-manger handled cold preparations. The rôtisserie handled meats, spinning whole animals over enormous open fires with the aid of young boys called turnspit boys. They worked in pairs, alternating every hour to avoid fainting. Their arms, it was said, developed unevenly. Then there was the pastry room, the soup station, the fish larder, the spice apothecary, and even a department just for sauces. A single sauce might require 10 steps and a small army of ingredients. It was not uncommon for a demi-glace to simmer for 8 hours while the saucier mumbled prayers to St. Lawrence, the patron of cooks. The kitchens had their own infrastructure. Bellows for fire management. A pulley system for transporting ingredients. Storage rooms like medieval vaults, cooled with ice blocks harvested from frozen ponds in winter and stored under straw. Even the water had its hierarchy. Spring water for the king's tea, river water for boiling vegetables, and rainwater. Filtered, blessed, and only sometimes used, supplies were monumental. Every week, deliveries arrived by wagon. Carts full of eggs, cradled in hay, barrels of wine and vinegar, crates of oranges from Spain, and, most fragile of all, sugar. White sugar was precious, and so heavily guarded that one cook reportedly slept on the sack to prevent theft. Coordination was military. Orders were relayed via runners, sealed scrolls, and, occasionally, code words when secrecy was required. The swan has landed once meant a rare breed of fowl had arrived and should be fast-tracked to the king's supper table. The logistics resembled a naval campaign. Timing was everything. Dishes had to arrive hot, garnished, and staggered in sequence. If one course was late, the entire rhythm collapsed. To prevent disaster, decoy dishes were prepared. If the roast quail was delayed, another identical plate would be ready to replace it. And all of this effort was in service of a man who might take only a few bites. Still, the kitchens operated with a kind of reverent madness. Cooks took pride in their precision, their timing, their knife work. Many came from families of cooks, trained from childhood to peel grapes without tearing the skin or julienne turnips into near-invisible threads. Visitors who toured Versailles rarely saw the kitchens, but they heard of them. Tales of ovens large enough to hold a pony, of a bread room with its own fireplace, of a custard vault so delicately chilled it was said to hum. Historians still marvel at how the system functioned with so few modern tools. No refrigeration, no timers, no gas ovens, just heat, sweat, intuition, and the unrelenting expectation of perfection. Next time you microwave leftovers and think. This took forever. Spare a moment for the cooks of Versailles. They were delivering 100 dishes a day, through a maze, without wheels, while wearing wigs. There is a moment, just before the king enters, just before the silver covers lift, just before 100 courtiers lean forward in synchronized anticipation, when the food itself becomes the spectacle. Welcome to the art of edible displayed at Versailles. Presentation wasn't just important. It was sacred. Meals were an extension of Baroque theater, lush, intricate, symbolic. The table was a stage, and every dish a prop designed to awe, flatter, and mystify. The flavor could be subtle, the fragrance faint, but the look? The look had to be unforgettable. Imagine a roasted peacock reassembled with feathers intact, its neck arched in permanent pride, and its breast meat replaced with truffle-stuffed pheasant wrapped in gold leaf. No one dared touch it. It simply preened at the center of the table until replaced by a sugar swan that melted into raspberry sauce under a hidden candle, or consider a vegetable tableau. Cabbages carved like roses, carrots twisted into flaming curls, beets sculpted into busts of Roman emperors. One such dish was described by a visiting Dutch ambassador as a garden that quivered with intent. He declined to eat it, for fear of offending the asparagus. These were not meals. These were messages that a seafood platter might depict Neptune's chariot, with shrimp reins and oyster shell wheels. A roast lamb might arrive on a bed of mint dyed pink with beetroot, surrounded by lemon slices cut into star shapes and balanced on sugar cubes. Symmetry was everything. A misplaced fig could send a steward into quiet despair. The more elaborate the feast, the more likely it included illusion food. Meats that looked like fruit. Cakes that opened to reveal poetry scrolls. One memorable dish resembled a pile of gilded cannonballs, but turned out to be glazed chestnuts filled with cream and cinnamon. Louis loved this game. He would often pause before touching a dish, examining it like a jeweler appraising a gem. Sometimes he ordered dishes to be displayed only, not to be eaten, just admired. Behind this artistry was a team of cooks, decorators, sculptors, even florists. Sugar work was especially prized, so delicate it could shatter under a heavy sigh. There were edible statues, edible fountains, even edible birds' nests made of spun sugar and pistachio paste. And don't forget the centerpieces. Giant edible castles, miniature battlefields with candy soldiers, mythological scenes crafted from pastry. One banquet in 1683 featured a replica of Mount Olympus made from nougat and meringue, with caramel lightning bolts suspended on wires. Mercury lost a wing mid-dinner, but no one complained. These displays weren't just for Louis. They were for the court, for the ambassadors, for the world. The Sun King's table was a political statement, a living canvas of wealth and taste, and sometimes it backfired. One attempt to serve a trifle inside a gelatin model of Versailles ended in collapse. Another, involving live doves released from a pastry dome, startled the Dauphine so badly she spilled wine on her lace cuffs. Historians still debate how many of these extravagances were actually eaten. Most likely few. But they were documented, sketched, admired, and remembered, because in Versailles, even food aspired to immortality. Let's step outside the dining hall for a moment. Not far, just out onto the frost-glazed balconies of Versailles, where the gardens have turned quiet, and the air smells like chimney smoke and sweet rot. It's winter. Which, in Louis XIV's court, meant one thing above all: duck. The Sun King's diet was nothing if not seasonal. Not because he was an early adopter of farm-to-table sensibility, but because in the 17th century, seasons dictated availability and appetite. Cold weather brought its own menu, rich with heavy meats, roasted roots, and warming spices. Gone were the delicate spring sorbets and citrus jellies. In came the thick stews, the dark sauces, and the fowl with feathers still clinging to their roasted skins. Duck was king in January. Braised duck, smoked duck, duck glazed with wine and cherries. The colder it got, the more duck appeared. The theory? Duck meat was hot and dry, ideal for combating winter's cold and wet properties, according to the lingering doctrine of humoral medicine. Alongside duck came venison, goose, and wild boar. Game was at its peak in the cold months, tender from the frost, and considered safer to store and serve. Louis's winter menus often included ragouts of hare with black truffle and pheasant en robe, a pheasant dressed in the skin of another bird. A double disguise. A culinary masquerade. Vegetables changed too. The bright greens of summer gave way to slow-roasted turnips, pureed chestnuts, and caramelized onions. Cabbage became a staple, sometimes simmered with ham, other times simply perfumed with nutmeg and a spoonful of duck fat. Even the bread grew denser. The bakers of Versailles switched from airy rolls to dark, grainy loaves filled with dried fruit or crushed almonds. Meant to strengthen the stomach, They also doubled as makeshift heaters, warm, fragrant, and slightly too hard to chew with bad teeth. Desserts got heavier, too. Apples baked with clove and honey, quince paste with walnuts, sugared figs dusted with powdered ginger. There was a dish called frozen cream with cinnamon, essentially the 17th century version of ice cream, but only served indoors by a roaring fire. And of course, the wine changed. Gone were the crisp whites and rose-flavored roses of summer. Winter brought fortified reds, mulled with spice and sometimes thickened with egg yolks. Yes, egg yolks. One recipe calls for red wine, cinnamon, sugar, and a whisked yolk to make a thick, custard-like tonic. Historians still argue whether it was a beverage or a dare. The kitchens adjusted seamlessly. Logs were stacked higher. Braziers burned round the clock. Fat was saved, butter was hoarded, and bakers planned around snowfall. One clerk recorded a 1677 snowstorm that delayed the arrival of oranges from the south, forcing the king to eat only 3 and in sour mood. Interestingly, the season also affected mood and etiquette. Winter meals were longer, quieter, more intimate. The king spoke less, perhaps because of the cold, perhaps because of the fatigue that came with darker days. Candles flickered sooner. Music leaned toward harpsichord solos and somber ballads. But the food, it roared. It came in waves, full of smoke and spice and layered texture. The dishes weren't just meals. They were counterpoints to the outside world. A fire in edible form. Louis was known to request specific dishes tied to weather. "Bring me the snow pigeon," he once said, referring to a small bird stuffed with breadcrumbs and thyme, roasted until the skin resembled frost. Another favorite, potage noir, a black broth made with prunes, cloves, and burnt onion. It looked terrible. It tasted magnificent, while the gardens slept and the fountains froze. Versailles feasted, because nothing warms a king quite like duck fat and good timing. If there's one thing Louis XIV loved more than duck confit and Baroque harpsichord music, it was an excuse to feast. Luckily for him, his calendar was positively littered with them. Every week, it seemed, brought a reason to celebrate. Saint days, name days, royal anniversaries, military victories, real and exaggerated, celestial events, and the occasional spontaneous celebration of Louis's mood. One time, he ordered a feast because the moon looked particularly round. Let's start with the saint days. France in the 17th century still operated on a deeply Catholic rhythm, and every day had a saint attached. For the more obscure saints, Saint Zeno, for example, or Saint Honoratus, the palace acknowledged them with a special soup or dessert named in their honor. Honoratus, predictably, got a custard. Major saint days, like St. Louis, conveniently also the king's own name day, warranted full ceremonial banquets. Tables were lined with lilies and gold. The dessert tower alone sometimes reached 3 feet in height and was rumored to sway slightly with every footstep. Royal birthdays were an entirely different matter. For his own, Louis preferred surprise. Yes, surprise. He would often delegate the planning, instructing his maitres d'hotel to impress me anew. This led to increasingly creative feasts, one held entirely by candlelight with phosphorescent desserts, another where every dish was shaped like a crown. The soufflés did not survive. Victory feasts were frequent, even if the victory was diplomatic or mildly exaggerated. After a treaty was signed with Savoy, a banquet featured 100 separate dishes representing the flavors of peace. No one could name them all. One diplomat simply labeled them mostly sauce. There were seasonal fates too. spring feasts in the garden, summer suppers near the canal, autumn harvest meals with entire pigs roasted on site, and winter meals in glittering halls lit by mirrored sconces and firelight. Each feast was an opportunity to display the bounty of France and the ingenuity of its cooks. And then there were the invented celebrations. One of the most famous was Le Jour du Soleil, or Day of the Sun, a day Louis created just to honor himself. The feast included dishes like golden rays, saffron rice molded into sunbursts, solar eggs, eggs poached in wine and gilded with yolk foam, and a flaming dessert called Chariot of Apollo that required for servants and a fire extinguisher disguised as a wine decanter. Guests were often caught off guard. One morning, a visiting Polish ambassador was told he would dine simply, only to find himself seated beside a roast peacock stuffed with pastry and truffles, its beak painted with edible silver. Even solemn occasions were punctuated with food. After the death of a favorite hound, the king held a silent supper in its honor. Dishes were prepared in shades of gray and beige, and no music was played. The souffle fell. No one commented. Historians still argue whether these feasts were about joy or power. Were they expressions of abundance, political tools, or simply indulgent pageantry? Perhaps all three. Because for Louis XIV, every meal was a stage, and every stage deserved a grand opening night. In Versailles, food didn't just nourish the body. It whispered secrets, shaped alliances, and sometimes stabbed you in the back with a silver fork. Welcome to the high-stakes world of political gastronomy. Imagine receiving a pear tart at court. Lovely, yes? But what if it arrived without cinnamon, Louis's favorite spice? That wasn't just a missing ingredient. That was a warning. Maybe your influence was waning. Maybe your patron was displeased. Maybe, just maybe, you were being edged off the plate. Every bite at Versailles was symbolic. A dish served cold might imply insult. A seat far from the soup tureen could signal social decline. And heaven help the unfortunate noble whose wine glass was filled second, not first. Food was a language, and only the fluent survived. Courtiers would spend days maneuvering just to appear in the right proximity to a favored platter. A roast pheasant placed within reach of a duchess might suggest favor. That same pheasant, set 3 seats away, meant she was in exile, socially, if not physically. Cooked gifts became currency. One could woo a rival with candied almonds, or snub them with burnt figs. The pastries delivered to a chamber door at dawn were studied more carefully than political dispatches. One minor noble's career was reportedly launched because he baked a marzipan sculpture of Versailles that made the king laugh. Another's was ended by an oversalted trout. Even menus were curated for effect. The maitres d'hôtel worked closely with court informants to tailor dishes to the guests, flattering with remembered flavors or excluding known favorites to cool rising stars. There were alliances over wine, betrayals over bread. Once, during a tense negotiation with an English envoy, the French served a traditional stew without garlic. An omission so baffling it made the envoy wonder if he'd already lost the deal. And desserts? Oh, desserts were weapons. Too extravagant, and you might seem vulgar. Too plain, and you risked appearing cheap. But get it just right. Say, a millefeuille subtly tinted with the royal emblem, and you might earn a smile that opened doors. Historians still argue whether one infamous ambassador's sudden dismissal had anything to do with the apricot tart he praised just a bit too enthusiastically. Louis, after all, preferred plums at Versailles. Food was rarely just food. It was gossip, gesture, seduction, and sabotage. A banquet could make you A misplaced garnish could break you to SO the next time you drizzle honey over cheese. Remember, in the Sun King's court, that pairing might have cost someone a pension. If you thought Versailles was a place of harmony and elegance, you've clearly never seen three chefs from three different nations argue over a sauce. Welcome to the most delicious war no one talks about. The culinary clashes of the French, Italian, and Spanish factions in the royal kitchens that let's set the stage. Louis XIV court was not just French. Thanks to diplomatic marriages, ambassadorial entourages, and the king's own flirtation with international flair, the palace kitchens became a melting pot of Mediterranean ambition at one end. The French chefs, the backbone of Versailles cuisine, trained in local traditions, steeped in the sauces of Burgundy and the creams of Normandy, they saw themselves as the rightful guardians of royal taste. Rich, butter-heavy, and fond of slow-cooked opulence, they viewed foreign flair as ornamental at best. Enter the Italians. Italian chefs arrived with the marriage of Queen Marie Therese cousins and the trend of all things Roman. They brought olive oil, garlic, risottos, and a terrifying tendency to undercook vegetables. French chefs accused them of ruining cabbages and overly flattering the tomato. The Italians countered with complaints of dairy tyranny and sauces that drown the soul. Then came the Spanish. Their food was bold, aromatic, and unapologetically earthy. They used smoked paprika, almonds, saffron, and cooked everything over fire like it was a minor revolution. Spanish dishes like gazpacho and paella occasionally made their way into court menus, usually renamed, resauced, and politely claimed as French innovations. The result? A constant tension simmering just beneath the copper pots. Kitchen spaces were divided by style. One wing for pastry, another for broths, and still others unofficially colonized by culinary camps. Arguments flared over how much garlic was too much garlic. Secret substitutions were made. Recipes were stolen, modified, or accidentally misplaced. A famed incident involved a lasagna dish presented as layered pâté of Versailles. The Italian chef recognized his work, flipped a cutting board, and stormed out. The dish, ironically, was declared charmingly new by the king, and yet, from all this chaos, innovation emerged. Hybrid dishes became the quiet glue of the kitchen. Spanish-style roast duck with French fig sauce. Italian almond milk custard with Burgundy pears. A Milanese tart that somehow involved 5 cheeses and a Breton crust. These blends delighted the court. Louis himself seemed to enjoy the competition, perhaps seeing it as a metaphor for France's dominance. He once remarked, "It takes many flags to season a stew." Still, the rivalries endured. Cooks placed bets on whose dishes would be eaten first. One pastry chef developed an almond cake so elaborate it took 2 weeks to construct. It collapsed during plating and was henceforth called the Treaty of Marzipan, a term still used to describe diplomatic failures. Historians debate how much Louis knew of the back kitchen drama. Some believe he orchestrated it to keep the chefs sharp and divided. Others think he was just amused. But one thing's clear: Versailles was a culinary battlefield. The sauces were velvet, but the glances could kill. Let's take a bite out of curiosity, shall we? Tonight, we step into the part of Louis XIV's kitchen that smelled less like France and more like adventure. A chamber filled with odd fruits, strange seeds, and mysterious beans, some sweet, some bitter, some completely baffling. Welcome to the court's flirtation with colonial cuisine. In the latter half of the 17th century, the world came knocking on Versailles' gilded doors. French ships returned from colonies in the Caribbean, Africa, and the East Indies laden with new ingredients: cacao, vanilla, coffee, nutmeg, tamarind, cinnamon bark, dried bananas, and, most terrifying of all, pineapples. Louis was intrigued. But he was also cautious. Court records tell us the first pineapple presented to the king was treated more like a royal visitor than a snack. It was not eaten. It was displayed, turned, sketched, smelled, and finally sliced by the royal botanist, not a cook. The flavor, Louis said, was like sugar and wine arguing. He wasn't wrong. Chocolate caused even more drama. Introduced to the court via Spanish nobles, it was served as a hot beverage, frothy, bitter, and spiced with chili and annatto. The first time Louis tried it, he reportedly made a face like he'd swallowed ink. The court physician declared it invigorating. The cooks, predictably, added cream and sugar. Eventually, chocolate became a staple. Coffee fared better. Served in delicate porcelain cups, often sweetened and sometimes blended with orange zest or cloves, it became popular during late-night salons. Louis himself preferred tea, especially green tea scented with jasmine, but tolerated coffee for diplomacy's sake. One cook noted, "He drinks it as one might endure a cousin's poetry." Nutmeg, mace, and cinnamon entered the sauce rotation. Vanilla was tried, briefly, in a venison stew. No one ever made that mistake again. Tamarind appeared in sorbets. Dried banana was once mistakenly baked into a pie and caused such confusion that it was rebranded spiced island root. Cooks were both thrilled and terrified. Each new ingredient brought a wave of creativity and risk. Could they combine cassava flour with French wheat? Should coconut milk be served hot or cold? What on earth did one do with all this allspice? Experimentation ran wild. There was a dessert called Jungle Cloud, a layered pudding of coconut, lemon peel, and crushed almond sponge. Another dish, Tropical Drift, featured quail glazed in molasses and lime, served on banana leaves. The king took one bite, then ordered it served every third Thursday, until he forgot. Not all trials succeeded. A cassava loaf exploded in the oven. One chef tried to use cloves to perfume a fish broth, and the resulting odor cleared the room. A mango sauce turned green under candlelight and was immediately banned, but some dishes endured. Cocoa cinnamon confections, coffee custards, candied orange peel, and gingered pears became fixtures of court menus. And while the Sun King never embraced all foreign flavors, he enjoyed their novelty. They were conversation starters, diplomatic tokens, and, when successful, proof of France's reach. Historians still argue whether these exotic additions changed French cuisine or simply ornamented it. Some believe colonial imports expanded the royal palate. Others say they merely fed the illusion of expansion. Either way, the next time you drink hot chocolate, thank Louis's chefs, who once feared it was poison and drank it anyway. Before the first bite, there was the pause, not for grace, not for etiquette, but for fear. Because in Louis XIV's Versailles, some foods were considered not just distasteful but dangerous. They were omens, illnesses, reputational risks served on porcelain plates. Let's talk taboos. First on the blacklist, mushrooms, especially raw ones. Despite their modern culinary prestige, they were often linked with poison, madness, and mystery. Louis would never eat them uncooked. He once reportedly ordered a tray removed simply because it smelled too earthy. Melons also carried a bad reputation. Physicians warned they were cold and wet, in the humoral tradition, and could unbalance the stomach. particularly when eaten in the morning. Louis, while not superstitious himself, avoided melon if the moon was full. Make of that what you will. Garlic, beloved by peasants and scandalous at court, was considered far too aggressive for a royal palate. It was said to inflame tempers, sour breath, and invite impolite conversation. The few times it appeared in court cuisine, it was buried beneath cream or renamed aromatic bulb. Crabs and lobsters were sometimes banned from the king's menu, not for their taste, but because of their appearance. Their claws were thought to evoke illness or deformity. More than one royal physician suggested they pulled the body backward. No one knew what that meant, but it sounded ominous. Superstitions didn't stop at ingredients. Timing mattered too. It was unlucky to serve eggs on the day of a diplomatic negotiation. Eggs symbolized fragility. Too much risk. One cook delayed breakfast for an entire ambassadorial visit just to avoid the metaphor. Bread had rules. It must be sliced, never torn. Torn bread was thought to mimic poverty or chaos. Once, a noble was seen ripping a loaf and was quietly uninvited from 2 balls. He blamed arthritis. No one believed him. Round fruit, served whole, was frowned upon during illness. It was said to resemble a closed fate. Thus, apples were always peeled, segmented, and rearranged into flowers. Pears, if overripe, were considered food for the dying. This led to the Great 1689 pear panic, when a sickly-looking tart sparked rumors of the king's demise. Certain dishes had hidden meanings. A trout prepared with almonds implied a wish for fertility. A pie with 13 prunes foretold betrayal. Most cooks played along. A few took liberties. One chef, angry at his demotion, served a roast duck stuffed with onions and cloves arranged in the shape of a broken crown. The message was subtle. The punishment was not. He was reassigned to the bean cellar. Even cutlery played a role. Forks were fine, but only silver. Gold utensils, though more valuable, were thought to interfere with digestion. Knives had to be rounded. Pointed knives were too violent for the king's table. One exception was made for a ceremonial cake cut with a saber. But only once. It left crumbs on the carpet. Historians still argue whether these taboos were based on medical theory, magical thinking, or just the anxieties of a court where everything was performance. Perhaps all three, but in a palace where even the soup was symbolic, fear had flavor. By the time he reached middle age, Louis XIV's teeth were in rebellion. Years of rich sauces, sweetmeats, wine, and the medicinal powders favored by his doctors had taken their toll. By his 40s, the Sun King was missing several molars. By his 50s, his smile was more memory than reality. And by his 60s, chewing had become a team effort, but Versailles never paused. The feast had to go on. Enter the era of soft foods, creative textures, and royal dental diplomacy. That Louis's dental troubles weren't exactly a secret. His courtiers knew the sound of his jaw clicking. His valet knew which side he favored for chewing. And his cooks? They knew how to disguise texture as elegance. Hard crusts were out. Pâté became smoother. Meats were shredded, pureed, or cooked so slowly they could be eaten with a spoon. One record refers to veal so soft it apologized on the way down. Soufflés became more than fashionable. They became functional. Light, airy, warm, and yielding, they were easy on the gums and impressive to the eye. Savory versions with cheese or truffle appeared at breakfast. Sweet ones floated in cream at dessert. One chef famously baked a peach soufflé so tender it collapsed when whispered to. Cooks also invented new presentations to assist the king. Meats were rolled, fish deboned in the kitchen, fruits stewed rather than raw. Even nuts, once a crunchy snack, were soaked in wine or ground into pastes. Praline, in its early form, was as much a balm as a treat, but the dentures. Ah yes, the dentures, crafted from ivory, animal bone, and occasionally other people's teeth. Louis's false teeth were a marvel of 17th century prosthetics and 17th century discomfort. They pinched. They clicked. They sometimes flew. One dinner guest recounted the king leaning forward to speak, and a molar clattered onto his plate. With grace befitting a monarch, Louis covered it with a napkin and continued his sentence. This dental drama reshaped etiquette too. Silence during meals became fashionable, not for solemnity, but because too much talking made things fall out. Soft murmurs replaced hearty toasts. Servants learned to interpret subtle gestures for more sauce, less crust, and water served lukewarm to avoid shocking the nerves. The palace glassmaker even developed special goblets with thinner rims, easier to sip without tilting the head too far. One noble commissioned a gold spoon with a curved lip for dignified scooping. Desserts rose to new importance, not just because they were sweet, but because many were naturally soft: custards, puddings, meringues, and creams. Gelatins were molded into playful shapes. Sorbets were spoon-fed in private. Still, Louis never let his limitations diminish the spectacle. If anything, he leaned into the challenge. Meals became more ornate, not less. Dishes were plated in towers, sauces spun like ribbon, pastries engineered like cathedrals. His palate remained sharp even when his bite faltered. Historians still argue how many foods were adapted purely for his dental needs versus fashion's whims. Some say soufflés became popular because of his gums. Others think the trend was inevitable. But one thing's clear: the king's appetite never dimmed. He simply learned to feast without teeth, and somehow made it look regal. There is a hum at the king's table, not of bees or music, but of whispers, glances, and expertly folded rumors passed alongside the gravy. This is the dinner table of Versailles, where every bite is seasoned with gossip. Seating alone was a political battlefield. Who sat closest to Louis? Who was offered a seat at all? Entire careers rose and fell with the placement of a chair. The duchess who moved from 2 seats down to 1 seat beside the king's elbow gained influence overnight. A baron once tried to bribe a steward to have his chair accidentally upgraded. He ended up dining in the gallery. Conversations were strategic, loud enough to be overheard, soft enough to remain deniable. A countess might mention a duchess's declining health within earshot of her rival. A bishop might innocently inquire about an absent general's loyalties. A misplaced compliment could doom a marriage proposal. One whispered she's terribly fond of figs was enough to stir speculation for a week. And then there were the performances. A spilled wine glass could mean clumsiness or protest. A napkin left unfolded might suggest contempt. When one nobleman deliberately dropped a spoon, it was said to be in reference to a recent loss at court. Louis pretended not to notice. The rest of the table froze. Food became cover. A particularly silent spoonful often disguised a deeper thought. Nods were passed like courses. One subtle toast, barely above a murmur, was said to have triggered a change in foreign policy. Servants were ears in motion. The ones who poured wine also poured gossip into the kitchens. Messages were passed in bread crusts, in folded napkins, even carved discreetly into the underside of cheese boards. The king himself participated, though rarely directly. He would lift an eyebrow at a bold comment, raise a glass to silence a boast, or ask an innocent question. How was your hunt, Marquis? That landed with the weight of judgment. Historians still argue whether Versailles dinners were more about politics than food. Some suggest the court might have managed fine with just wine and rumor, because in the end, the power at Versailles wasn't just in the palace. It was in the pause before the next bite, the sidelong glance across pheasant pie, and the quiet murmur that could rearrange the future. There were days at Versailles when no butter sizzled, no pheasant roasted, and no sauce dared dream of cream, because even the Sun King had to fast, a devout Catholic, at least in public policy. Louis XIV observed the holy rhythms of the liturgical calendar, and so did his kitchen. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Fridays, Saints' Vigils, and the occasional act of personal penance shaped what appeared on his plate. And what didn't? During Lent especially, the transformation was striking. Rich, meaty meals vanished. In their place came fish, eggs, legumes, and so many eel dishes it's a wonder the species survived. Eel pie, eel stew, jellied eel, eel sausage, which was, generously, eel shaped into a circle. One guest wrote, "I have dreamed of eels. I cannot escape their gaze." Butter and cream were taboo. Olive oil became the substitute, though French cooks grumbled it was too Italian and not sufficiently indulgent. To maintain opulence, they disguised fasting foods with elaborate presentations. Fish molded into peacocks, lentil puree piped like frosting, and faux roasts carved from pressed nuts and breadcrumbs. Confession weeks prompted sudden menu shifts. If Louis was preparing his soul, he expected his stomach to follow. One Monday, a breakfast of truffled eggs was replaced, without warning, by a dish of boiled barley and lemon. A valet fainted from confusion. Wine was still allowed, technically, but sweetened or spiced wines were discouraged. Cooks began steeping fruits in water or vinegar to create mock cordials. One daring creation, a Lenten shrub of raisins, rosemary, and rosewater, became strangely popular. The king called it surprisingly clean. But fasting didn't always mean deprivation. Court chefs took pride in transforming limitations into creativity. A Lenten banquet could feature 40 separate dishes, all within canon law. Oysters were fair game. So were mussels, snails, frogs, and certain birds ambiguously classified by clerics as non-meat. The goose debate, in particular, raged for years. And of course, there were loopholes. One fast day, a sweet custard arrived made with almond milk and egg yolks, but no sugar. It was declared spiritually compliant because no one enjoyed it. Another meal included bread shaped like fish, blessed by a bishop and baked with herbs. It tasted like penance and parsley. Confessors and bishops wielded influence over the menu. A priest might declare a meal too lavish, prompting an apology from the chef and a lighter substitute. One unlucky confectioner was exiled from the palace for suggesting sugar sculptures during Holy Week. He later opened a successful bakery in Lyon. Advent, though shorter than Lent, also imposed restrictions. Meat was minimized. Breakfasts grew simpler. Dinners leaned on roasted roots and herb soups. And yet, even then, creativity bloomed. A Christmas Eve feast once featured a nativity scene crafted from chestnut puree and quince. Historians still argue whether Louis fasted out of piety or politics. His public devotion certainly reinforced his divine right image. But there are private notes suggesting he sometimes cheated with anchovy toast. Either way, the kitchen followed suit, because in Versailles, even abstinence was theatrical, and holiness, like hunger, was best performed with a flourish. The halls of Versailles never truly slept. Even after the candles were snuffed and the orchestra retired, faint footsteps echoed through the corridors. Not guards, not ghosts, just hungry nobles on a mission. Because even kings get midnight cravings. Louis XIV may have eaten grandly by day, but at night, especially in the later years of his reign, he nibbled. Quietly, strategically, sometimes guiltily. There was an entire unofficial network for what the palace staff called the Moon Pantry. A handful of servants, under strict instructions, maintained small stores of favored snacks tucked away in discreet cabinets, behind panels, and occasionally, inside hollowed books. The king's preferred midnight indulgence? Bread soaked in wine, then lightly toasted and dusted with cinnamon. It was soft, easy on his teeth, and could be eaten by candlelight with minimal chewing. He also had a fondness for cold roast chestnuts, sweetened almond paste, and, strangely, slivers of aged cheese served on warm towels. One valet claimed he once saw Louis dipping slices of apple into mustard, with the solemnity of confession. But he wasn't the only one that Madame de Maintenon favored stewed plums. The Dauphin hoarded candied violets and small pouches of rose-scented sugar. One duchess had a locked drawer containing salted pistachios and spiced melon rind. Another kept a flask of mulled pear wine hidden in her embroidery basket. Nobles would bribe kitchen boys for leftover pastries or sneak down to the scullery disguised in dressing gowns. A young count once attempted to fry goose fat over a chamber candle. The smell lingered until sunrise. He was banished from supper for a week. Some snacks were illicit, not because of their ingredients, but because of timing. Eating outside of prescribed hours was seen as undisciplined, even decadent, which, of course, made it more delicious. There were whispered rules. Never eat anything that crunches. Never drink from silver flasks. They clink. And always have a loyal valet who swears he saw nothing. One footman recalled being summoned in silence, handed a note that read only cherries, and returning to find the king asleep with a half-eaten bowl beside him. He snored, the footman wrote, as if he'd swallowed summer. Occasionally, these secret snacks crossed into diplomacy. A Spanish ambassador, gifted with quince paste, sent a box to the king's quarters with a note. Best enjoyed when the moon is jealous. It was eaten within the hour. Historians still debate whether the midnight meals were necessity, nostalgia, or just stubborn hunger. Some claim they were remnants of youthful habits. Others see them as private rebellions, quiet breaks from public perfection. Either way, the Moon Pantry endured, and long after the last waltz faded, Versailles remained softly alive, lit not by chandeliers, but by the glow of candlelit crumbs. Let's unwind now with something delightfully trivial about a royal ranking. Not of generals or duchesses, but of dishes. Tonight, we're counting down the confirmed and rumored favorites of Louis XIV. The foods that made him smile, sigh, or, in one case, recoil so dramatically a courtier thought he'd been stung. That we begin, naturally, with number 10.10. Milk bread rolls, soft, sweet, and served warm under embroidered napkins. Louis liked these just before sunrise, sometimes with honey, sometimes with salted butter, if the day required fortitude. 9. Stewed apricots, served cold in summer and hot in winter. Cooked with cloves and sometimes rosemary, they were considered a gentle dessert. Legend says the king once offered a spoonful to a visiting composer who burst into tears. 8. Quail and grape must, a robust main. Quail braised in the young juice of grapes, seasoned with herbs, and garnished with roasted walnuts. The king praised it as melancholy in the best way. 7. Truffled eggs, a breakfast indulgence. The eggs were soft-boiled, split gently, and filled with a black truffle puree. His confessor disapproved. The king didn't care. 6. Poached pears and red wine, a nighttime treat. The pears were peeled and simmered slowly with cinnamon and orange peel until they glowed. One footman described their scent as the quiet before thunder. 5. Almond custard, silken, warm, and often infused with rosewater. Served in delicate bowls painted with mythical beasts. Louis ate it when nervous. He once requested 3 bowls before a diplomatic meeting. 4. Roast pigeon with sage and plum, earthy and sweet. The king insisted it be served with the bone, but not the struggle. A dish that appeared at autumn hunts and birthday dinners. 3. Fresh artichoke hearts, boiled lightly, and served with melted butter and a squeeze of lemon. Louis adored them. One spring he requested them daily for a fortnight, declaring they tasted like invention. 2. Soft cheese on warm bread, not officially fancy, but deeply favored. Louis preferred a particular cheese from Brie, ripened just shy of collapse. Served on slices of bread, kept warm near the hearth. It made appearances at both public banquets and midnight, and at number 11. Pheasant in cream sauce with white truffle oil, the undisputed favorite. Rich, velvety, faintly aromatic. Served often on holy days and birthdays. The king once delayed a meeting with the Pope's envoy because he was on his second plate, but not every dish was beloved. There was one the king openly detested. The vile, salted cod with caper vinegar, intended as a Lenten staple. Served once, never again. The king called it an insult to fish. A rumor claims he threw a napkin over the dish and asked for anything from the garden, even the weeds. Historians may debate politics and policy, but in this, the Sun King's taste was unmistakably cleared. He preferred warmth, subtle sweetness, texture without challenge, and above all, comfort hidden in sophistication. Before we had wellness influencers and herbal cleanse kits, we had Versailles, and its deeply theatrical version of medicinal cuisine. Because for Louis XIV, food was not merely sustenance or spectacle. It was also a pharmacy that lets descend now into the strange and steaming realm of royal digestion, where every meal was followed by a tincture, a powder, or a highly opinionated physician. The king's physicians, particularly his infamous court doctor Antoine d'Aquin, believed that digestion ruled destiny. They operated under the framework of humoral theory, the belief that health depended on the balance of bodily fluids. Too much bile? You might feel melancholy. Too much phlegm? Prepare for sluggishness. An ill-timed apricot? A disaster. Thus, everything Louis ate had an afterthought, a countermeasure, a remedy, or a digestive correction. Start with the powders. Chief among them, powdered rhubarb root, dried to dust, and stirred into a cup of warm wine. It was both a laxative and a favorite of the royal apothecary. Another was the elusive powder of white pearl, allegedly crushed from rejected court jewelry. Whether it helped or simply felt expensive is still debated. Tonics came in bottles so elaborate they could have doubled as crown jewels. Many were infusions, fennel steeped in vinegar, rose petals in brandy, mint in whey. Some were described as cooling to the liver, others as bracing to the blood. And then there were broths. Oh, the broths, morning broths, to wake the system, pre-supper broths, to prepare the gut, sleep broths, laced with chamomile and dried fig, to lull the body into compliant slumber. One popular option combined veal bones, bay leaf, nutmeg, and something only ever referred to as calming root. It was ladled from silver pitchers and served in cups shaped like tulips. The king also partook in cleansing days. On such days, he consumed nothing solid, only herb teas, broths, and occasionally one carefully poached egg. These were meant to release toxins. He reportedly slept better after such abstentions, though not as deeply as his snoring suggested. One medicinal treat was syrup of poppy, added to wine during particularly restless evenings. It dulled the nerves and, if overused, the conversation. Another was barley water mixed with orange peel, consumed before court speeches. To clear the voice, they claimed. To delay fainting, suspected many. Culinary pharmacy also extended to desserts. Candied angelica was said to aid breath. Violet pastilles soothed the throat. Rose petal jam prevented melancholy. The king often requested these with tea, even if he was not ill. Better to guard the balance than restore it, he once muttered. Historians still argue whether all this tinkering did any good. Some say Louis was genuinely healthier than average. Others blame the tonics for his more eccentric declarations. But one thing is certain. In Versailles, medicine tasted sweet, fragrant, and just a little theatrical, because nothing, not even health, escaped the stage. In a palace where every detail was a performance, food was never just food. Tonight, we unwrap the sweet, spicy, and occasionally suspicious world of edible gifts, where jam could curry favor, spices could sway policy, and a well-timed tart might change a career. Welcome to Versailles, where ambition tasted like apricots and honey. Louis XIV's court thrived on gifts. Formal tributes, spontaneous offerings, carefully wrapped intentions. And none were more diplomatically palatable than culinary creations. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned. Bring something edible. It must be rare, fragrant, or artfully preserved. A Turkish envoy once presented the king with a chest of saffron and a bottle of rose syrup sealed with wax. Louis accepted them with a nod, and later asked for the syrup to be chilled and served with almond cake that a Swedish baron brought salted reindeer meat and cloudberry jam. The reindeer was politely declined. The jam became a breakfast sensation. For a month, Versailles whispered of northern sunshine in a jar. Spices were political currency. Nutmeg from the Indies, black cardamom from Persia, cinnamon bark in satin-lined boxes, all tokens of reach and relationship. A noble might offer clove-studded oranges to remind the king of winter alliances. A duchess once gifted saffron ice cream. The king blinked twice, then requested a second spoon. Bakers, too, joined the bribery circuit. One Parisian pâtissier designed a pastry shaped like a fleur-de-lis, filled with candied rose petals and marmalade. He delivered it with a poem. Louis was amused. The man received an invitation to present at court. The pastry, sadly, melted on arrival. Preserved fruits became messages. Glazed cherries suggested joy. Dried figs, longevity. Apricots meant anticipation. A marquis once sent candied lemons with a note. For bright thoughts on gray days. He was promoted a month later. Chocolate was a special case. As both luxury and novelty, it came with ceremony. A box of spiced chocolate pastilles from Florence was once delivered in a music-playing box. Louis laughed. The box was kept. The chocolate was served. Not all food gifts were elegant. That a provincial noble once sent a smoked ham with a handwritten recipe. The ham was described as decidedly robust. It ended up in the hunting lodge. The recipe, however, amused the king's mistress, who requested it be prepared for a picnic. Even court physicians joined the edible exchange. One presented a vinegar cordial with 17 herbs to sharpen wits and soften moods. Louis called it intriguing and drank half before a war council. The results remain classified. Historians still argue whether these gifts influenced decisions. Some say yes, the court was hungry for novelty. Others insist it was theater, but at Versailles, to be remembered was to remain. And if your marmalade helped your cause, well, who could blame you for a little extra sugar? By the final year of his reign, Louis XIV was no longer the vibrant gourmand who once demanded 14 courses before noon that he was, by then, a monarch in slow retreat, from battlefields, from mirrors, and from his once insatiable appetite. Tonight, let's tiptoe gently into the royal bedchamber as age, illness, and legacy narrow the Sun King's plate down to its quietest portions. In 1715, the palace grew quieter, the dinners shorter, the candles fewer. Louis was in his 70s, his health faltering from gangrene, old war wounds, and time itself. His famous appetite had become inconsistent, some days absent, other days sudden and strange. Gone were the rich sauces and layered meats. Now came gentle broths, barley softened with cream, and small servings of poached apples. Fish was flaked finely, served cold, and sometimes not touched at all. One courtier wrote, "The king no longer eats to dazzle. He eats to remember." Meals took place in his private room. The golden table remained, but fewer guests sat around it. Often, he dined alone, with only his confessor and a valet standing by. Silver bowls replaced porcelain. Fewer utensils. More cloth napkins. His favorite dish in those final weeks? Soft bread soaked in rosewater, then gently warmed over coals. It was said to bring him comfort. Sometimes he would ask for it twice. There were other quiet favorites. Stewed plums with cinnamon. Thin leek soup, served lukewarm. Rice pudding flavored with orange peel. The sweetness, it seems, still mattered. But most of all, he asked for tea. Green, jasmine-scented, sipped slowly and silently. One day, when he refused a meal entirely, his valet whispered, "Sire, the kitchen weeps." Louis smiled faintly and said, "Tell them I am full, with history." In his final days, the palace kitchens reduced their noise. Less chopping, more steeping, fewer pans, more care. The cooks who once raced to innovate now crafted comfort. Familiar flavors, gentle textures, nostalgic steam. And when the Sun King finally slipped away, it was said his final request had been for a spoon of pear, though no one remembers if it was ever brought. Historians still discuss his policies, his wars, his architecture. But perhaps, in those final quiet meals, we see him clearest, not as a god-king, not as a tyrant, but as a man who, like all of us, ended with tea, a memory of fruit, and silence at the table. So, here we are. The candles have gone soft. The clink of silver has faded. The last spoon rests quietly in the bowl. Let your breath slow now. Sink deeper into your pillows. Picture the long golden halls darkened for the night, the air scented faintly with cinnamon, lavender, and warm bread. There's no more spectacle, just the hush of velvet drapes and the muffled shuffle of distant slippers. That you're safe. You're still. You've wandered through banquets and broths, soufflés and secrets, and now you can let it all slip away. Like steam off a quiet cup of tea, sleep, dear listener. Dream of roses, pastries, and the quiet dignity of an old king's final meal. End of script. Sweet dreams.